Have you ever thought about adding embroidery to your sewing? So it turns out there are a few tips and tricks that'll make the process a lot easier for you. Today I'm going to try my hand-embroidery embroidery and we're going to make a beautiful linen blouse with an embroidered yoke for spring. And as always, I'm going to be sharing important tips all along the way as I make this blouse. And at the end, I'll recap all the tips for you so you'll know exactly what to do if you want to try embroidering some clothing for yourself. So let's get started. One thing I've discovered about my own style is that even though for the most part I wear mostly kind of muted colors like black or ivory or cream or different shades of blue or pink, even though those colors are understated, where I really like to express myself is through texture and really interesting fabrics or details. So for a while now, I've wanted to try embroidering something. And I used to embroider a lot as a kid, and I really just love that heirloom quality it has, especially when you do it by hand. So today we're gonna make the Seamwork Ames blouse, which is this billowy, bohemian looking blouse that I'd say it has sort of a modernized Edwardian look to it, but it can definitely also read 1970s. And if you want to make this blouse, you can find it on Seamwork and I'll put a link to it down below. And by the way, just as a reminder, our YouTube subscribers get half off a Seamwork membership, so check out the link if you want to access over 200 sewing patterns at a really low price. Okay, back to Ames. So Ames has this really lovely lined yoke, which is just the perfect place to add surface details like embroidery. So I'm going to be adding embroidery to the yoke all along the curve. And the fabric I'm using is just this very simple white linen. I decided that I wanted to do white work embroidery, which basically just means white thread on a white fabric because I really want that subtle heirloom look. I already have the Ames cut out, so my first step today is going to be deciding what sort of embroidery pattern I want to use. I started by looking through some of my books for inspiration. I have this beautiful Japanese book called Flora, and it's all floral embroidery. It has this section on white work that's really inspiring. I also have books on heirloom sewing, a book of whitework designs, and some more modern embroidery books that showcase tons of different samples. You can also find a lot of vintage transfer designs online for free. I'm going to link to an article we wrote with lots of resources linked, so definitely check that out if you're looking for vintage or modern designs you can use. One thing I really love was this image of an embroidered edge with little French knots all over, and it's forming kind of a polka dot pattern. I thought that would be a fun detail to add along with a more elaborate floral pattern along the edge. I found this beautiful design in my vintage whitework book, so I decided to combine that with the French knot idea. And I like that it also has a lot of French knots in it, and the shape of the design seems like it would fit well on the yoke. By the way, I find sketching my designs and really planning everything out to be super helpful with projects like this. I just keep adding to it as I'm making design decisions. The pages that are included in our free wardrobe planner are really great for that, and it's a totally free download, so I'll link to that below as well. Next up, let's figure out what supplies we need. Here's what I have for my embroidery project. I have an embroidery hoop to hold the fabric taut. I have hand embroidery needles. I have tracing paper to trace the design I'm going to create, and a transfer pencil to transfer it onto the fabric. And finally, I have a few different sizes of embroidery floss. I chose a pearl cotton for this. I wasn't sure which size I would like best, so I trialed a few of them on a scrap piece of fabric. I used a size 12, a size 8, and a size 5. This was also a good time for me to practice the stitches I'd need to do. I made a lot of mistakes, but I started to get the hang of it as I went along, so I definitely recommend this. That brings me to tip 1. Practice before you stitch. You might even want to get a few different sizes of floss like I did and make a little sampler for yourself. As you can see, the look changes a bit with the size of the floss. I ended up liking the look of the finest floss, which is the size 12. Next, we need to get our fabric ready. I'd already cut out the bib lining, but I decided that for the outer pieces, I'd trace the pattern pieces onto my fabric and just cut large squares around them instead of cutting them out first. The reason for that is that you should have an overhang of a few inches on all sides of your hoop, and unless I used an itsy bitsy hoop, that really wasn't possible. So that brings me to tip 2, embroider and then cut your pieces. This isn't necessary if you're embroidering on something very large, but for most pieces, if you're embroidering anywhere near the edge, it can be easier to just trace your pieces and cut them out after you've embroidered them like I'm doing. Tip number 3 is to draw in the seam allowance. I lightly marked the seam allowance here so I don't accidentally embroider too close to it. Next, we're going to transfer this beautiful design onto the fabric. The first step is to trace your design using a transfer pencil and tracing paper. Just remember that the design is going to be transferred backwards. Since I'm mirroring the same design on each side of the bib, I'll have to trace it twice. Next, you place the transfer with the pencil side down on your fabric and press it for a few seconds with a warm iron. So this did not come out at all like I expected. It's super light and blurry and I can barely see the design. So I'm gonna have to do a little research on how to make it work better. Okay, let's try this again on some scrap fabric. This time I really pressed hard with the pencil, so the transfer is a lot darker. So that's tip number 4. I also learned that it helps to heat up your fabric with the iron before you transfer it and to wiggle the iron a little bit on each section to get it to transfer. I used the tip of the iron to really press every part of the design onto the fabric. That worked a lot better. So let's try it with the real design again now. So remember, tip number 5 is to heat your fabric when you transfer. And tip number 6 is to hold your iron to the transfer longer than a few seconds if you can, and move it a little so it doesn't scorch. That's a lot better. It's not perfect, but I can definitely see what's going on now. I also wanted to add some French knots all over the bib, so I drew those in with a pencil. That made me realize that I should probably put the knots on the back of the bib too, so I'll draw those in as well. Now it's time to embroider. I love that embroidery is a bit slower and also more portable than sewing, so I'm going to work on this a little each day over the next few days. Embroidery is super relaxing to me, and I ended up finding it almost kind of addicting. I'd bring it with me places, like when we went to lunch, I could work on it while waiting for my food, or I'd do it in bed or while I was listening to a podcast, and it's a lot like knitting in that way. It's something that you can just do while you're doing other things, and it's just really relaxing to me. I worked on it over the course of about a week, and I just found it really, really peaceful. All right, so the embroidery is all done now. So I've made the motifs on both sides of the front bib. You can see here, they've still got the pink from the transfer pencil, but that should wash out when I'm all done. And then I also added these pretty French knots on the back bib. So it would go like this, the back bib. So you can see the little kind of polka dot look that it's got going on now. And it's time to now sew the blouse together. First, we'll cut out the bib pieces since I traced them earlier, but I didn't cut them out so I'd have larger pieces of fabric to work with. I'm already starting to see how it's going to look. Now I'll assemble the bib and attach the placket. I really like the way the embroidery is looking right now, especially those French knots across the front and back. It's just really, really pretty. All right, next we'll sew the collar and attach it to the bib, then sew in the bib lining. Okay, now the bib and the collar are all assembled here. Let's see what it looks like if I were to wear it like a little dickie. Let's see. So you can kind of see how the embroidery is going to be placed once this is done. All right, let's sew the body. Now we'll sew the side seams of the shirt and then sew the sleeves at the underarm and sew the body together. All right, so I sewed the placket and now we just have a few things left. Just need to sew the elastic into the cuffs and do the buttons, and we are just about done. By the way, do you like seeing vintage inspired details like this? You want to see more videos of interesting details that you can add to your projects? Let me know in the comments if you do, because I absolutely love finding ways to customize clothing like this, especially with details you don't see every day and ready to wear. All right, so the sleeves are done and it's hemmed, guys. So all that's left to do now is to do the buttons. So I'm gonna go and do the buttons, and then I'm gonna give this a wash to get all of this pink transfer marking off so we can see what the embroidery really looks like. And then I'll come back and try it on. We'll see how it looks. For the buttons, I chose some very simple pearly buttons. I didn't want anything fancy that might compete with the details of the blouse, so I just chose something really simple. Well, hi Rusty. I just took this out of the wash and there's still a bit of pink in there. So I'm gonna try applying some stain remover and seeing if I can get it out. Yikes. I did some research, and apparently getting transfers out is a really big problem for a lot of people. So First, I sprayed it with some stain remover, and I used OxyClean because that's just what I had. Then I put a little dish detergent on there and soaked it in cold water, which is what the manufacturer's website suggested. And once I did that, the pink was pretty much gone. I was really worried at first because I worked so hard on this embroidery, and to have it stained pink like that, it just would have been a real bummer. But honestly, even though I can still see some faint pink if I look, it's about 98% gone, and I don't think I'd really notice if I weren't looking for it. So that brings me to tip number 7, which is to test removing the transfer pencil on some scraps of fabric before you start. Stain remover and dish detergent really helped me, so you might want to have some on hand. All right, now let's see how it looks. I absolutely love the way this embroidery came out, and I feel so good about all the time I invested in it. There's just this sense of pride when you really take the time to add special details like this. I think it's because, number one, you've put the time into it, so you just feel more attached. But I also think it's the fact that I put so much thought into customizing it the way I want, deciding what sort of design I wanted, how I'd place it, what floss to use. It makes it feel just more expressive and more special. I hope I've inspired you to try some embroidery on a future project of your own. And if you do, here are the 7 tips I shared that I think will really help you out. Tip number 1, practice before you stitch. And you can even try a few different ideas and floss sizes before you start. Tip number 2, embroider, then cut out your pieces. And that'll leave you with bigger pieces of fabric to put in the hoop. Tip 3 is to draw on the seam allowance. And this will help you decide where to place your embroidery. Tip 4, don't be afraid to apply pressure with the pencil. I found that it really needed a lot to transfer well. Tip number 5 is to heat your fabric when you transfer. Heat it with the iron to make the transfer easier. Tip 6 is to hold your iron to the transfer longer than a few seconds if possible. And tip 7 is to test removing the transfer pencil and some scraps of fabric before you start. Have some stain remover and some dish soap around so you know the final design is going to come out. If you like adding interesting and unusual details to your sewing projects, you might also enjoy a recent video on elastic shearing, which is a really great way to add some interest and some shaping to boxy garments at the same time. And we'll link to that in the description below. All right, I will see you soon.